good afternoon, good morning, everybody. So let me take this opportunity since I am part of the organizing committee of the conference to just present my discussion live. And the title is Paradox and Distance, the Black Nazarene as Eikon for for the devotee during the pandemic. One's visit to the Nuestro Padre Jesus Nazareno for a devotee is not complete without the traditional ways of showing one's own devotion and offering of prayers and intercessions. Among these is the pahalik, in which people line up in order to touch or kiss a part of the statue of the Black Nazarene placed at the altar of the Basilica. This is even magnified during the celebration of the Traslacion, especially in the recent years, where devotees from all over the country, even from abroad, line up to kiss or touch the image before the procession. From the lens of popular piety, we see that this in itself is devotion per se, a very corporeal expression of faith that signifies absolute dependence to the Poong Jesus Nazareno. This has remained to be a norm until the fateful arrival of SARS-CoV-2 in the country, which was soon known as the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the highly contagious nature of the virus and the possible threat to the lives of many, the country was put on a strict lockdown. The national capital region was placed on enhanced community quarantine. And one of the measures that were imposed was the closure of churches. More than that, contact activities were prohibited, including the touching and kissing of images in the church. Quiapo Church and the Nazareno is no exception, as the pahalik must be suspended, giving way instead to the patanaw, in which devotees from a distance can only look at the Nazareno as one offers prayers. Upon the loosening of these quarantine restrictions and the modifications of community quarantine levels, devotees were gradually allowed to perform acts of devotion sans this particular practice of the pahalik. Small as it may seem to be a modification, this presents a great challenge for the devotee, especially if touch is identified as a form of connection with the divine, given the sacramental reality of divine presence. However, this study, viewed from the perspective of phenomenology and aesthetics, aims to show that these small modifications brings with it a great insight worth exploring. This is so because it touches upon a basic reality that the devotee experienced during the pandemic. In this forced distance, so to speak, imposed by the situation, the devotee may find himself or herself distant from the Nazareno. But this distance, paradoxically, presents another form of intimacy, that of the gaze. Through the thought of philosopher Jean-Luc Marion, we see that in this situation, the Nazareno transforms into an icon. Properly speaking, in Greek, it is Eikon, one that gazes back and makes the devotee aware not only of his or her own situation in this pandemic, but also, and more importantly, the distance between God and the human person that cannot be traversed by human means alone. In the end, it points out that the reality of the distance is, paradoxically, a distance that also marks intimacy that God establishes with the human person, a distance that can only be traversed by nothing other than God himself as the absolute other, placing himself out of charity in the situation of the human person. With this, we show that in this pandemic, a new and genuine relationship becomes established between the devotee and the Nazareno as an object of devotion, one that snugly fits in the circumstances that the human person is facing in this pandemic. This is to be discussed in three salient points. First, we see that this forced distance establishes the Nazareno more than just an image to be normally touched. That is, given the circumstances before the pandemic, the Nazareno serves as a devotional images that is meant to be touched as it is. This may seem to be a common feature among all the statues and images that we have for devotion. However, what makes this a significant phenomenon is precisely that reality that what devotees are all used to touching now only becomes an object to be gazed at. As one looks more closely into this phenomenon, we see that the Nazareno, in a way, and to a certain extent, becomes quote unquote reduced, so to speak, to an image that is merely for sight. Being thus, we can consider that phenomenologically speaking, the Nazareno becomes an icon, following from the Greek eikon, as a form of art through which the believer is drawn to the divine reality portrayed in the icon. Of course, when one can contend that it does not have the same aesthetic characteristics as that of an icon, properly speaking. It is not a flat image, but one that is three-dimensional. The Nazareno, unlike the famous icons in the history of the church, such as the Pantocrator or the Visit of the Angels by renowned icon painter Andrei Rublev, the Nazareno does not gaze back as it stares into the supposed path that the Lord Jesus Christ walks as he carries the cross, rendered in three dimensions. However, despite this lack of similarity with each other, we see that the relationship between the object of the devotion and the devotee becomes similar as that of the icon. It is by virtue of the distance that cannot be traversed by touch that the Nazareno becomes, in a way, an unfamiliar figure. One subject to be approached only on the level of the gaze, with the devotee offering his or her prayers from a certain distance. In this similarity and difference, we bring out the basic reality of distance. Marion points out that an icon as an indication of the otherness of the divine that is portrayed in the icon. And what makes it so is that as the icon gazes back at the gaze of the subject who sees it and stares at it, in a way, the subject sees, quote unquote, nothing. That is the hollow nature of the gaze. As Marion says, the icon opens in a face where man's sight envisages nothing, but goes back infinitely from the visible to the invisible by the grace of the visible itself. It is a gaze that resists objectification, one that conveys the reality of the absolute mystery of God that cannot be encapsulated by the senses or by the mind. The icon serves as a reminder that ultimately God is absolutely other, an otherness that is also glimpsed by the human subject as he or she stares back at the hollow pupils of another person. However, this other is an absolute other that is far distant and far more mysterious than the other person in his or her own flesh and blood. This mystery that surpasses physical characteristics and limitations, a mystery that overflows and goes beyond the categories of the mind. A quote unquote saturated one, so to speak, becomes present in a very real way to the subject, even to the point of being defined by the very object that the subject gazes upon. How is this applied in the Nazareno during the time of the pandemic? The devotee, as the one who gazes from a distance, is now thrust into a new relationship with the object of his or her devotion. Though the Nazareno does not resemble that of an icon, it becomes an iconic representation, an icon in the form of a statue. A distance that is normally not there, normally traversed by touch, is established in this relationship. A distance that can only be realized in the very act of gazing, of looking at, which in turn serves as the only means through which the devotee comes into contact with the Nazareno. It is, phenomenologically speaking, a reminder that even the devotion to the Nazareno is not confined within the conventional, as the devotion is now re-established temporarily, as it would or could be, so to speak, from the normal act of touching to that of merely gazing. The divine reality that the Nazareno symbolizes establishes a new relationship and a new form of devotion, at least or perhaps even beyond this pandemic, a pair of gazes that cross each other. This brings out a second point, namely that in reality, the Nazareno also mirrors several layers of distance that is present in the life of the devotee during the pandemic. On one level, we see here that the relationship between the Nazareno and the devotee brings out the very human reality that is in this pandemic, the need for physical distancing. It becomes a norm and a practice during the pandemic as backed by health and scientific studies. But more than just a fact, it becomes perceived as a human reality that one has to adjust to. The distance between people, the distance between the human activities that one is used to, and the distance from the conventional reality that one has before the pandemic. In a way, this relationship between the Nazareno, as an icon properly speaking, reflects and mirrors the human condition in which it is situated. The gaze of the icon, thus, gazes back at the devotee and brings the reality of his or her situation to him. On a deeper level, however, it becomes a reminder of the insurmountable distance between God and the human person, that which lies as the foundation of the resistance to familiarization and conceptualization. Indeed, for the devotee, the object of devotion appears distant, away from the intimacy of the touch. However, this situation is a reminder that while God remains close to the experience of the human person, one that can be known, seen, and even touched, there still remains something that cannot be completely understood about him. God then stands as the unfamiliar and the incomprehensible, one that the human cannot fully encapsulate in an idea, and one that he or she cannot hold on to for his own personal interests and ends. As Marion states it, God remains as a phenomenon that fully saturates our thoughts and senses, one that we will not ever get used to, one that will always be an other to us. This distance, however, is something that is paradoxical in nature, and this shows the third point. The encounter with God in this manner, by seeking one's distance from Him, is also paradoxical in nature, as it indicates a form of intimacy that has never been taught before. For Marion, the encounter with God will always bear a reality that is contradicting, paradoxical in nature, one that brings out opposite characteristics contained in one reality. As seen and explained earlier, the distance between the devotee and the Nazareno is a distance that is physical, one that also reminds one of the reality of the situation during the pandemic. Moreover, it reminds one of the distance that lies between God and the human person. Yet, it is in these realities that we see a greater intimacy, one that takes on a quite different form in this situation. And to see this requires an in-depth phenomenological reflection of the image to the help of Marion's concept of saturated phenomenon and revelation as, per se, the saturated phenomenon, in which what reveals is not measured and fit by the human subject, but instead measures and fits the human subject according to how and what is revealed. And indeed, we see that the distance between the Nazareno and the devotee is a shared distance, one in which the human being feels one's own distance from God, and through the Nazareno, the distance is also present for God Himself. In a way, there is an intimacy by relation through this shared distance. The Nazareno is precisely one with, to put it more strongly, in union with the devotee distanced from him, to which we may rhetorically ask, both from a phenomenological and even from a theological standpoint, how else does this God be in greater unity with the devotee who gazes upon him from a distance, if not in suffering as well in this distance? Do we not see that revelation bears the suffering brought by distance, and in this suffering with brings himself closer? Does it not cross the distance precisely by sharing and uniting himself with that distance? Hindi ba't nakikiisa ang paghihirap o sa paghihirap ang Poong Jesus Nazareno sa pagiging malayo din nito? Sa debotong pakiramdam ay malayo sa kanya. As Marion says in one of his seminal works on Revelation, a saturated phenomenon, the idol and distance, or again, between God and man. Incommensurability alone makes intimacy possible because withdrawal alone defines the Father, just as the paternal withdrawal alone saves for man the sumptuous liberty of a son. Distance as the stance, therefore, means duality alone allows recognition. Communion progresses with separation, where gazes are exchanged. Understood in this manner, we see how the paradox is all the more established here. The Nazareno indeed serves as an Eikon in the strictest sense, as it bears the situation to the devotee as the beholder, and at the same time bears with that distance. The more that the devotee is forced to be far from the object of devotion, then also the more the Nazareno becomes closer to the one who gazes at him. And it is in this union in distance that we see the Nazareno as saturated phenomenon, going beyond the usual confines of thought and entering into the very reality of the devotee, transforming the meaning in the crossing of the gazes and drawing toward the beholder to him. As a summary, these 3 points show that the pandemic has brought forth a unique and a quite unexpected relationship between the believer and the believed, the beholder and the beheld, the devotee and the Nazareno. As an Eikon, it brings forth the otherness of the object gazed at. In turn, this becomes the access to understand the crossing of the gazes anew, as being held in a distance which at the same time brings the Nazareno closer to the devotee. Theologically speaking, it becomes a moment of greater solidarity and unity of the suffering Christ and the suffering human. Of course, this comes only on the level of interpretation and philosophical reflection, coming from the perspective of a phenomenology that puts the appearance and givenness of the phenomenon at hand. It may be further verified by more empirical and sociological studies on the effects of COVID-19 on the dynamics of devotion, specifically to the Nazareno. But at the very least, we have a philosophical starting point, one through which we can say that even in the seeming fruitlessness of this quote-unquote modified devotion, one sees that it is full of meaning and indeed bears fruit in the lives of the devotees. A pleasant afternoon to everybody. Viva po Jesus Nazareno.